We're going to look at the process of photosynthesis today. Photosynthesis is the process that autotrophs undergo in order to create their own energy. When we think about autotrophs, we often think about plants, but it's important to note that there are bacteria called cyanobacteria that can actually undergo this process as well. Now you should be aware of the equation that is carbon dioxide plus water in the presence of sunlight and chlorophyll results in glucose plus oxygen plus water. The other thing that you should be aware of is the balanced equation. Now the reason that we balance equations is because the reactants need to be able to equal the products. You can't have something coming out or becoming a product that wasn't inputted in the first place. We can't have elements or molecules appearing from nowhere. So these are the reactants, and over here we have the products. So the way that we can balance this equation is by having 6 carbon dioxides, 12 water molecules, glucose remains the same, 6 oxygen gas molecules, and 6 water molecules at the end. Now this equation only gives us a really simple look at the process because we can see what's going in and what's coming out. What we're going to look at now is actually how these reactants create these products. There are 2 stages. The first stage is known as the light dependent stage, which means that it depends on light. It occurs in the thylakoid membrane, and it is the first process that occurs. Now there is a structure called grana in the chloroplast, and grana looks something like this. Sort of looks like a stack of pancakes. What grana is made up of is the thylakoid membrane. So all the grana is thylakoid membrane stacked up on top of each other. So when we're discussing where this process occurs, thylakoid membrane or grana. Now the second process is called the light independent phase or stage, which means that it does not need light. It occurs in the stroma, which is a gel matrix that surrounds the thylakoid membrane within the chloroplast and is filled with enzymes. Now because this process, the light dependent process, occurs first, we're going to look at that first. Now it's important to know what we actually need for this stage to occur, and what we need is we need sunlight, we need chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is found obviously in the thylakoid membrane because this is where this first process occurs, and we also need water. Now the other thing that I'd like to mention is the fact that when I do discuss water molecules and water molecules being broken down and split into hydrogen ions, electrons and oxygen, I'm talking about one water molecule, but as you can see here, there are 12 coming in, so just remember that this does occur 12 times. I'm talking about it as a single water molecule, but it does occur 12 times as 12 water molecules come in. So we're looking at the light dependent stage again. This occurs in the thylakoid membrane. So the first thing that we have is we have sun energy, and that is harnessed by the chlorophyll, which is in that thylakoid membrane. And remember we talked about the fact that we needed water. What that sun energy does that is harnessed by the chlorophyll is it splits these water molecules into hydrogen ions, 2 electrons, and half an oxygen gas. So I'm going to discuss what I mean by this now. So hydrogen ions, or any ion, is a charged particle, and we can see here that these hydrogens are positive. So that means that they've lost a negative or they've lost an electron. Now hydrogen ions can actually be known as protons. The reason that that is because on the periodic table hydrogen is number 1, which means that it's got 1 proton and 1 electron. As a hydrogen ion, or a charged particle that's lost an electron, it means it's lost all its electrons because it only ever had 1. So now it has got only a proton in the middle, therefore a hydrogen ion is the same thing as a proton. Now, because the hydrogen ions have lost their electrons, we now have 2 electrons here. And we also have half an oxygen gas molecule. Now you might say, I don't really understand that because there is 1 full oxygen. Remember, oxygen gas is O2, which means that this oxygen molecule is waiting for another oxygen molecule to join to create oxygen gas. Now remember what I said before, there are 12 H2O molecules coming in here, which means that really we've got 24 hydrogen ions, 24 electrons, and it also means that we've got 12 oxygens. And if we've got 12 oxygens and we're wanting to pair them up, it means that we actually get 6 O2 molecules. Okay, and that's where this comes from, up here, 6 O2. So oxygen is actually done at this stage. It is now released as a byproduct, which, as I said, we now see here. So let's now focus on the hydrogen ions and electrons that we have. So remember, this occurs in the thylakoid space, and the thylakoid membrane looks something like this when it's stacked up in a formation called the grana. So if we're to zoom in on one of these structures, we actually have hydrogen ions in here, and we have electrons. Remember that the oxygen now has already been released. This process is referred to as an electron transport chain, which is looking at how electrons get moved around by acceptor molecules and how we can create an ion gradient that actually starts creating energy. We'll discuss all that in a moment, but that is actually what an electron transport chain is, which is what we're discussing here in this process. Now, you might sit here and look at the fact that there is a high concentration of hydrogen ions inside this grana and a low concentration outside. So naturally, you would assume that these hydrogen ions would want to diffuse out. But they actually don't do that. The reason that they don't do that is because these electrons that are sitting here, that have been created, actually form a chain at the top of the membrane, and as they form this chain, they are excited and they exert a sort of energy that actually pushes these hydrogen ions into the thylakoid space, or the thylakoid membrane. Now that means that they're going against the concentration gradient, so they're sitting inside that membrane against a concentration gradient because they're at a higher concentration here. So that's why energy is required. So this has created a hydrogen ion gradient, which means that, again, there is just a difference in concentrations inside the grana compared to outside the grana in the stroma. We now get acquainted with a molecule called NADP. This is an acceptor molecule. It's also a coenzyme. What NADP does is it comes here to collect a hydrogen ion and 2 electrons. And when it does that, it creates itself a new name called NADPH. The reason that it's a H is because it's now carrying a hydrogen ion, hence the H, plus 2 electrons. Now NADP behaves similarly to ADP in that it is an acceptor molecule. It has potential, but it doesn't have a purpose until it actually picks up the molecules that it's waiting for. So NADP is waiting for a hydrogen ion and 2 electrons. So in its form as NADP, it's like a taxi waiting to pick up a passenger. And when it picks up its passenger, being hydrogen ions and electrons, it now has a purpose. This NADPH molecule is actually going to shuttle this hydrogen ion and 2 electrons to the next stage, which is the light independent stage. So that occurs in the stroma. So this hydrogen ion that's on this NADPH is now being shuttled to be used somewhere else. There are still hydrogen ions, however, in the grana or in the thylakoid space, and they are able to now leak out of a channel because some of these electrons have been taken away, so there's less energy exerting their pressure to keep the hydrogen ions in there. So now they're able to leak out. In this channel, ATPase is stored. Now you should remember ATPase from the ADP to ATP cycle. And what that does here is it's released and it is used to convert ADP into ATP. Now this hydrogen ion that is leaked out is actually incredibly important because it is involved in building up that third phosphate bond. Because remember, ADP is adenosine diphosphate, so it has 2 phosphates, and adenosine triphosphate or ATP has 3 phosphates. So the difference is that one is missing a phosphate, or ADP is missing a phosphate. So that hydrogen ion that leaks out is involved in building up that third bond between that second phosphate and ADP to create the third phosphate, which is ATP. Now that ATP that is created here isn't needed anymore in this stage, so what actually happens is it joins NADPH in the stroma for the light independent stage.